Alright everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at a serious exchange in Jamaica's Parliament where Opposition MP Julian Robinson is pressing Finance Minister Fayval Williams on several key parts of the national budget. And let me tell you, Robinson came prepared with numbers, projections, and some tough questions about inflation, wages, and even taxes affecting Jamaican businesses. Let's break down what happened.
Right. So some of the allocation would be reflected there, but it would be for the preliminary pre-investment work that needs to be done on these projects. As you can imagine, when you have large projects.
Minister, my colleagues asking you to speak a little more into the mic. Yeah.
Some of it is reflected there. As I was saying, as you can imagine, when you have large projects, there's a lot of pre-investment work that has to go on. And by pre-investment, we mean the scoping out, the design, whatever architectural work needs to be done, environmental work, and so on. So there is some allocation for that type of work. Right, so there's 10 billion there to ensure that that component of the work will go on in this fiscal year.
In 26, 27,
upcoming fiscal year.
All right, so the 2.4 billion US in funding for private sector projects, that would be dependent on projects that are presented to, for example, like an IFC as an example, the private sector arm of the World Bank. So if individuals present projects, that money is available. Is that what you're saying? It's not right, funding for central government at all.
So the IFC, the IDB invests those arms. However, those investments will be coordinated with government as well, because government also will have significantly large projects that the private sector can take on.
Okay, so you anticipate those being PPPs that are in the pipeline that would be accessed?
Right, there are some in the pipeline.
Okay. All right. In terms of, you alluded in your opening remarks to the situation in the Middle East and the impact that is likely to have on the economy. You indicated the movement in oil prices. It has two effects. It will have a balance of payment effect, but also you will collect some more tax revenues from GCTs and STCs. What contingencies are in place to deal with the likely impact of inflation from the increases in oil prices, particularly on those who are most vulnerable?
All right. So the war that started, it's in its first week. The impact we would begin to be very concerned about the impact depending on how long the war goes on. In the near term, we will see the first effect of it through oil prices here in Jamaica. We expect consumers in the near term to manage their budgets accordingly. Again, it's going to depend the longer term impact of it and whether or not government will be required to assist will depend on the duration of this war that's happening in the Middle East. So it's something that we're watching closely. And of course, if government is required to assist, that is something that the cabinet will deliberate on, and then there will be an announcement to the country.
All right. In terms of your projections, and I noted the Financial Secretary in response to a question from the opposition leader, indicated that the inflation rate figure for 25-26 was revised downwards from 10% to, I believe, 5.6. You have projected a nominal GDP growth of 9.2% for 26-27 and a real growth of negative 0.5%, which assumes a deflator of 9.7%. Given the downward revision in inflation, does that deflator, do you believe that that deflator is still accurate and will still hold? Because inflation has moderated relative to the original expectations.
It's interesting that you should narrow in on that because that is the contention of the fiscal commissioner, that our inflation numbers were too high, and he pointed out the risk of that. So it's interesting now that we are being asked, why do we take that down to 5.6%? Well, let me say, at the time of the estimate of the 10%, you have to go back to December, January, when these numbers were being put together. You know, in the environment in which we were at that time, food prices were up significantly. You recall the price of green pepper and other items were just off the charts. So it was not unreasonable at the time to have estimated inflation of that magnitude. We have since seen in new inflation numbers, they've moderated quite a bit. And so we've gone back and made the reduction in that early number to reflect the new data that became available to us.
I totally understand that. I'm now going further to ask whether you believe the assumption of the deflator of 9.7% for 26-27, given the moderation of inflation, is still a number that you believe would hold, because you have almost, the outturn of inflation has almost been just over half of what the projection was. The 9.7 deflator assumes built in probably a larger than real inflation number. So I'm saying with the moderation and accepting now with the Middle East conflict that there are uncertainties. But I'm just asking if you still believe that that 9.7 deflator will hold.
We're expecting that to be lower.
Right, that's what I would anticipate, yeah.
But then it's a dynamic situation.
Right, because I said the war could, yes, and I'm accepting that, yeah. Can I shift a little to your wages and the provision for wages and salaries? You have a contingency of 42 billion that has been provided in the overall figure of 555 billion. Can you give a breakdown of what you anticipate the 42 billion to cover? Would it cover, for example, a provision for a potential IDT award coming out of the issue with the Jamaica Medical Doctors Association, as an example? Does it include the agreement of the commitment of a 2% increase that was made last year, or a commitment that was said last year, but I don't know whether that would be paid in the upcoming fiscal year. So I'm asking for what the 42 billion would cover in terms of the contingencies for wages and salary negotiations.
Member, as you correctly identified, the 42 billion that has been provided in the budget for wages and salaries anticipate that there will be a settlement in this in this new fiscal year. And we have to make provision for that, whether or not it happens.
Settlement of which one specifically? The JMDA IDT one? I know, and there may be others. Which specific ones?
For the government wage offer that's on the table. At least we had to create space for that in the budget. We don't, with regards to the IDT awards, we don't know where those will come out at yet. We have other contingencies in the budget from which we could draw from. But given that we know what is the offer from government, we're able to estimate how much that is and put that in the budget.
One of the issues raised by the Fiscal Commissioner relates to the misalignment of the negotiating cycle between the unions and the government in preparation for the budget. I know for 25-26, the unions would have presented their claims in about November of 2024 in anticipation of the new fiscal year. But it has taken the government much longer than anticipated to conclude those negotiations, which means you keep having to carry relatively large contingencies because you don't have an accurate figure of what your commitments are going to be. Can you commit that going forward for the next fiscal year that the negotiation cycle will align with the budgetary cycle so that in preparation for the budget you will have an idea of what your commitments are on the wages and salary side?
Okay, so the alignment with the budget will be, it's not just the government. The government can't just decree that wage negotiations align with the budget. You know how negotiations work. Two sides come to the table. This side says, I have A. The other side says, I want A plus, whatever that plus is. And it takes a while to negotiate, to come back to the table, to leave, come back again. And the two sides have to meet. Yes, I understand what the Fiscal Commissioner is calling for. It's calling for certainty in the budget. But that's why we have contingencies in the budget, because there are always uncertainties in the budget. Of course, government would love to settle with the unions. That goes without saying, but it takes two. It's not just the government. Government cannot decree a wage settlement. We have to sit at the table with the unions as many times as required for us to get to an agreement, and that's how it is. We could walk into Parliament and we could legislate, but in reality, the process is what determines the cycle of the wage negotiation. But I fully understand where the Fiscal Commissioner is coming from and just the risk to the budget when you have the wage negotiation outstanding without any idea of when it will be concluded.
All right. I want to shift to your revenue measures, and in particular the environmental levy, the increase in the environmental levy, and the movement of the levy from 75% to 100% of sales. This measure will place local manufacturers at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis those who import products. And it could be the exact same product. The importer would pay the levy on the imported inputs, whereas the local manufacturer pays 100% on the value of sales. So there is if you want to call it an unintended consequence, where the local manufacturer is placed at a disadvantage relative to the importer. Have you recognize that, and do you intend to address that anomaly or that deficiency in how the tax measure was proposed?
In short, member, my technical person, just from listening to your question, has indicated that that is not the case in terms of the domestic and the importer being on an uneven playing ground. That is not the case.
Meaning, you're saying it's not the case. So the importer pays on inputs, but the manufacturer pays on total sales. That's not the case?
The discussion started with government allocations for major development projects. Minister Williams explained that billions of dollars are being set aside, but not necessarily for construction yet. Instead, the money will go toward pre-investment work, which includes things like project design, environmental studies, architectural planning, feasibility assessments. According to the minister, about $10 billion will go toward preparing large projects before they actually begin. Robinson then questioned a $2.4 billion US funding facility meant for private sector projects. He wanted to clarify whether that funding was actually for government projects or mainly for private companies. Minister Williams explained that organizations like the International Finance Corporation and the Inter-American Development Bank help finance projects where the private sector can partner with the government. So in many cases, this would become public-private partnerships. The conversation then shifted to global events. Robinson asked how the conflict in the Middle East could impact Jamaica's economy, particularly through rising oil prices. Higher oil prices usually mean higher transportation costs, higher food prices, increased inflation. Mr. Williams acknowledged that the situation is still very new and said the government is monitoring the impact closely. If the conflict continues and inflation rises, she said the government could step in with measures to help vulnerable Jamaicans. One of the most technical moments came when Robinson questioned the government's inflation projections. Originally, inflation for the fiscal period had been projected at 10%, but the number was later revised down to 5.6%. Robinson wanted to know whether the government's GDP deflector assumption of 9.7% still made sense given that inflation had slowed. Minister Williams explained that when the earlier projections were made, food prices were extremely high, with some items like vegetables spiking dramatically. Since inflation has moderated, the government adjusted its estimates based on new data. Another major issue Robinson raised was $42 billion contingency set aside in the budget for wages and salaries. He asked what exactly that money would cover. For example, wage negotiations with public sector unions, potential rulings involving doctors, previously promised salary increases. Minister Williams explained that the government expects some wage settlements to happen in the upcoming fiscal year, so they had to set aside funds in advance in case agreements are reached. However, she also noted that negotiations with unions are unpredictable and can take time. The final major issue Robinson raised was the environmental levy increase. The government plans to increase the levy from 75% to 100% of sales. Robinson argued that this could place local manufacturers at a disadvantage compared to importers. His concern was that importers might only pay the levy on imported inputs, while local manufacturers might end up paying the tax on the total value of their sales. But Minister Williams rejected that claim. She said her technical team indicated that the system does not create an uneven playing field between local manufacturers and importers. Overall, this was a very detailed and technical exchange, but it highlighted some important issues: government project spending, global conflicts affecting Jamaica's economy, inflation projections, public sector wage negotiations, and tax policies affecting local businesses. And clearly, Julian Robinson was pushing hard for detailed answers from Minister Fayval Williams.